get themselves in and settled, and then we will get started. Let's call it 1 more minute. Okay, that's close enough to a minute for me. So let's get started. Welcome everybody to the October Bang Forum. If this is your first time with us, I hope you enjoy it and decide to join us more frequently. For those of you that have been joining us, this is our 4th Bang Forum now. Got kicked off in April, so welcome back. Today we've got a really exciting topic, and I'm actually really looking forward to this one and having Ron share about stakeholder engagement. And I am not going to bore you by reading his bio. It was in the invite and in our September newsletter, and it's on your screen now. So if you'd like to read that about Ron while I'm talking, but I would just like to say basically Ron is very passionate about teaching BAs and about stakeholder engagement specifically, which is great for me. It's also near and dear to my heart. So looking forward to this by Ron, and we're going to give him as much time as possible for his presentation. So Ron, if you want to take over, get my boring slide off of there and get yours up there, and we can get rolling.
Thank you very much. So is my screen shared at this point?
Yes.
Okay, let me move you so I can see. And you're going to help me with any comments or questions that people have, right?
Yes. So if you have any questions as we go, feel free to type them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that. If that's not getting my attention, go ahead and use the raise hand function in Teams, and we'll be paying attention to that as well.
So thank you very much. And I'm excited to be here. I've followed what's been going on in the Bang Forum, and I got to tell you, it's exciting. So I teach at PSU. Chris Dennis was an earlier presenter. He also teaches at PSU. We both think really highly of what is going on, and spreading the word as to how you do business analysis and project management. It's kind of dear to what we do. So, and we're in both of those 2 certificates at the PSU CEPI program. So today I'm going to be talking about stakeholder identification communications, which is also known as stakeholder engagement. It's also known as stakeholder engagement management, depending on whether you're talking project managers or whether you're talking business analysts. But I'm going to walk through some of the basics of what this is. I'm going to try to give you lots of tools. I know that going to these kinds of forums, it's nice to get some theory, might even be nice to get some stories, but walking away with tools is helpful. So I've tried to load this up with tools. Not every tool is going to be something that you're going to want to use for every engagement that you're in, but knowing about them is always helpful. And I mean, you know, you got to select the hammer when it's important to knock a nail in. But if you don't even know about a hammer, you're going to try to use something else, and it's going to be a lot harder. So I also want to start off with the basic philosophy that my job would be easy if it weren't for all those darn people. It's kind of a common thing, both for project managers and especially for business analysts, and especially for those business analysts that really like sitting behind spreadsheets, going out and eliciting requirements and talking through what the prototype looks like and making recommendations on alternative solutions. All of that is part of the job, and it involves people. And what we're going to talk about today is who are those people? And most specifically, how do you figure out who they are? How do you engage and work with them? And how do you make sure that you're not missing somebody along the line? So that's what we're going to work with. And I want to encourage you to ask questions as we go along, as opposed to waiting until at the end of the presentation, because it'll be more in context. And if you've got a question, I'll bet everybody else does. And I can expand and contract to fill most of the time. I'm going to try to give us about 15, 20 minutes at the end to be able to just discuss and talk about any questions or particular examples you want to go through as well. So today I'm going to start with who's a stakeholder. And it's important, I think, just to have that as a concept so that we're all in agreement as to what this is all about. And a stakeholder simply is anybody that cares. So if you're doing some business analysis work, so hopefully you can see my cursor. If you're doing this business analysis work, or you're doing a project and you're a project manager, and somebody finds out about it and they decide that they care, they are a stakeholder. You don't get to decide, they get to decide. But there's also times when you need somebody to be a stakeholder, and they may not even want to be a stakeholder or aware of what you're doing, but you need them to help complete your work. And so you'll be reaching out proactively to get information from them and working through them. Sometimes we also have stakeholders that don't know that they're stakeholders. We don't know that they're stakeholders, but they are stakeholders. Citizens of the state of Oregon, for instance, when you're doing governmental work, are very often in that category where you're doing things that are potentially going to affect them, either positively or negative. You don't know them individually. They don't know you. They don't even know that you're doing this, but they fit in that stakeholder group. And so figuring out how to make sure that they're properly represented and that you're getting the proper information to be able to make the right decisions, that's a part of this as well. And so we'll explore that in kind of a high level, but we'll explore that. So a stakeholder is anybody that knows about your project and cares, anybody that you need in order to be able to complete the work. And then that third category of people that don't even know about you and you don't know about them, but they're still stakeholders, and you have to figure out how to handle that. So I'm going to go over 4 parts to this stakeholder journey, if you would. And the first is going to be stakeholder identification. Now, figuring out who stakeholders are is often one of the most difficult things. And unfortunately, if you don't include some stakeholders that care or that you need, there's potential damage to the effort that you're doing. And so we want to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible. But at the same time, you can't treat hundreds of people potentially, and on a lot of projects and a lot of business analysis engagements, it's very large numbers of people. So we're going to do some analysis to find out and figure out who needs what kind of attention. And in doing that, we're going to try to understand what their relationship to the work you're doing is, and then properly tune your involvement with them and their involvement with you. And to that, we're going to talk about the actual management of that engagement. That includes the whole communications plan and trying to make sure that you're staying in touch throughout the life cycle of whatever this engagement is. And then finally, we're going to talk about monitoring and updating. Now, these number 3 and number 4 are going to go pretty fast. So if you're really worried and you're watching the clock, and I take a huge amount of time on 1 and 2, don't worry, because 3 and 4 are like a couple of slides. 1 and 2 are a lot of slides, because most of the tools are in those number 1 and number 2. So I want to start with stakeholder identification. Now, if you're a project manager, a lot of times what's going to happen is somebody that eventually becomes the sponsor possibly is going to come to you and say, look, I want you to do this project. And you're going to go away and you're going to either maybe put a team together, or you're going to work by yourself to put a charter together. Part of that charter is to identify who are stakeholders. And if you're steeped in project management, there are 5 process groups, the first of which is the initiating process group. And the main product that comes out of that is the charter. And if you're not a project manager, but you're a business analyst, you're still doing a project. And you're still going to be running through all 5 of these process groups. We're going to focus on this first one, because in order to write the charter and to figure out what is your project, what's your engagement, you have to get a pretty good idea of who's involved. That's the stakeholders. And the first person to go to whoever has delegated the work to you. So whoever that sponsor is, or whoever your boss is, whoever gave you this project or this engagement, ask them if there's anybody special that they're aware of that needs to be involved. Almost always the answer is going to be yes. And a lot of times they're going to start with something like, don't screw up because this person's going to be mad. Well, right away, you got a stakeholder. You got somebody you better pay attention to. They may say, oh yeah, and involve these people over here. And that might be for political sense. I know a lot of you are with the state. In fact, the vast majority are probably with the state. You guys, politics is a big part of the world that you're in. And the stakeholders that are involved in your engagements don't come without some strings possibly attached. You want to be aware if you don't pay attention to somebody, especially that the sponsor, the person that delegates to you is aware of that needs to be involved in, there could be a major miss. So start by asking whoever delegates this work to you, who is special? Who do we need to include? Who do we need to make sure that we communicate with? In the end, who do we want to satisfy and make happy? Have that conversation. Most of the time, they're going to be able to head you down the path of coming up with an initial list of people that need to be in that stakeholder group. But beyond that, I would encourage you to put a group of people together. And these might be people that are going to help you with this engagement or the project. They may not be officially on that engagement or project yet, but ones that you think are going to be there, people that are aware of what this engagement is about, and maybe even some friendly stakeholders. And friendly stakeholders means people that aren't actually going to be working with you on this engagement, but are aware of the project and can help you figure out what's the scope of the project and who cares about it. Who are all these folks? My approach is to put together, I call it a workshop. I call it a workshop rather than a meeting because I want them to know that I'm asking them to get involved, to really dive in and do something. But it's basically a meeting. And 2 hours is the absolute max, which is interesting because I've been in meetings before to try to come up with stakeholders that went on and on and on. And if it's not properly facilitated, it will go on forever. Instead, what you want to do is properly facilitate. I'm going to talk about how to do that in a few minutes. Keep it short, come up with the best list you can, and understand that you're constantly going to be coming back and growing and modifying, maturing that list as time goes on. So in the olden days, we used to be able to meet. We would come together. There were these things called conference rooms, and we would go and sit around tables. But it's not that easy anymore. Some of you still can do it, but in small groups, and be very careful. But for most of us, we're more into this virtual world now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools that I would use if we're together in a physical world, but I'm also going to recommend how to take those same tools and move them into the virtual world, which is interesting because I'm finding that in the virtual world, some of these tools are powerful enough that we can get things done better than what we were doing in the world, the physical world, when we were all sitting together. So the two tools that I'm going to talk about is, well, actually one tool and these virtual tools is brainwriting. And those of you that have ever been to any class that I've ever taught, you've probably been told by me that brainwriting is the tool that you really need to know, because in my opinion, it's the go-to tool. When I'm eliciting requirements, brainwriting. When I'm trying to figure out what the work breakdown structure is for a project, brainwriting. When I'm trying to figure out who the stakeholders are, brainwriting. When I'm trying to figure out what are the problems for the project that we got to work through, you guessed it, brainwriting. Because it's a really fast, creative problem solving tool that you can use to pull information out from people. So I'm going to talk about that in a couple seconds. But first I want to kind of go through again, who are some of these stakeholders? And I'm going to do this through the lens of a business analyst, because it's helpful to even populate the list of who stakeholders might be for your work right off the bat. And if you're a project manager, your list is very similar to this. But as a business analyst, some of the people that you're going to be looking at are other business analysts. And this might be hard for you to read on the screen. So I'm going to read the left-hand column so that you can see it. But other business analysts, obviously the customer, and the customer is whoever is receiving the value of this work. So that could be internal to an agency, that could be internal to a department, it could be a citizen of the state of Oregon, or if you're in a for-profit company, it could be somebody that's actually going to buy something from you. But a customer is somebody that is going to receive the benefit of whatever this analysis is that you're doing. And you have to be a little careful because not all customers come in the same flavor. I'll give you an example, is that you have a direct customer, for instance. I'll take insurance. I'll take medical. That's easier. You've got the patient. Clearly, they're receiving the value of the medical work that is going to be done, the treatments. But their family potentially cares a whole lot about that treatment. And certainly the insurance company cares about that. And if we're talking about a specialist providing the service, the general practitioner might also be involved. So you've got all these layers that they're all customers. They're all involved in this value delivery chain, but you have to kind of unpack it and look at it. Here's another way to think of it. If you're providing a service and it's going to touch children and it's going to touch adults and it's going to touch people that are elderly, that's three major different categories that you want to consider. How do we touch each one of those? And even any one of those could be split in multiple different ways. Infants, toddlers, preschool, school. That you have to figure out what's the resolution, what's the detail that we need to get down to. And that's this whole idea of you want to segment your customer groups. Subject matter experts. I have never been on a project by which I found that a subject matter expert someplace was my best friend. And sometimes my worst enemy because they were telling me things I really didn't want to hear. But subject matter experts, by the definition of who they are, know more than you do about the subject that you're trying to look at. And so figuring out who the right ones are and helping get their involvement without taking too much of their time is a part of what this is all about. So they become part of the stakeholders. The end user, if you're writing software, who's actually using the software? Now, they may be receiving the value, but somebody else might actually be receiving the value. I might be using a piece of software in order to provide a service to somebody that's standing in front of me that is part of my job. So I'm the end user, but the value translation is to that customer that's out there. Then you have implementation subject matter experts, people that are going to help with the actual implementation of it. And this is, sometimes there's change management experts, sometimes they are people that understand the customer and value delivery. Sometimes they're going to actually work into the testing of whatever you're coming up with. Whether it's software or not, the same kind of roles can play. Operational support. And this is once you go live with whatever it is that you're trying to do, how does it stay live? How does it keep going? If you're the business analyst, the project manager might be a pretty important stakeholder if you're on their project. If you're the project manager, the stakeholder or the business analyst might be a very important one, or other project managers, because our projects these days are getting so complicated that we sometimes have multiple projects that have to work together, very locked together. Each one's got a project manager that has to synchronize and make sure that the end piece is going to be of value and that we're not getting some conflict along the way. Of course, there are suppliers, there's testers, regulators, unfortunately, or fortunately, it's actually kind of important, and the sponsors I mentioned before. Anybody on the project team or anybody that's actually helping, by definition, they're also stakeholders, which brings up a mental model that might be helpful, that when we get to this 2-hour workshop, you might even put this visually someplace where people can see. And this comes right out of the project management body of knowledge, but the business analysis body of knowledge refers to it, which is kind of interesting. There's a paragraph in there in the section around stakeholders where they talk about these same concentric circles without talking about the concentric circles, because of course the business analyst folks in Canada didn't want to steal from the PMI folks in the United States. I think probably not, but interesting that we're going to see the project management body of knowledge change this next year. And my guess is we'll see the business analysis body of knowledge change pretty soon after that. And radical change coming up from version 6 to 7 in project management, and probably the same kind of radical change from version 3 to 4 in the business analysis. Okay, back to my subject, identification of stakeholders. Anybody that's within the project is by definition is a stakeholder. And so you want to keep them in mind. Communications and working with them is absolutely critical. You really don't want to ignore and think that because they're close family, I don't have to pay a lot of attention. The opposite is true. They're in the key stakeholder group and they need to be included in every important piece of communication and involvement. We'll talk more about that after a while. Then you can go outside of the project, but still within the organization. You have to define organization here as, is this a department? Is it an agency? Is it the state of Oregon? What is the organization? And that organization is relative to the scope of the project or effort that you're doing. So if you're working on something that is just going to impact within the agency, then the organization would be the agency itself. But then you go outside of the organization impacted by the project. These are also stakeholders, and outside of the organization impacting the project. So it's just kind of a nice mental model. You start with who's on the team, and then who cares about this that's outside of the team but within the organization, and then who are we impacting, and then who's impacting us, and kind of work from there. So I'll go back to the 2-hour session, the workshop that I talked about, and the tool that is my choice tool. If we're physically together, I love to use what's called classical brainwriting. And classical brainwriting is built around index cards. Its cousin is the pin card technique, and I'm going to talk about that in a second as well. Index cards are cheap, they're easy, and you can pack a whole bunch of them when you go into that conference room. And what you do is you sit people around, the participants that you've got around a table, and you give each one of them a bunch of index cards. And I always like to give way more index cards than they could possibly need. And then I show stacks of additional business cards, because what I'm trying to get people to think of is abundance of ideas is better than too few. So if we're talking about stakeholders, coming up with too many stakeholders is better than missing some. And the challenge that I'll ask them to do is on each index card, write one stakeholder, either by name or by group, and then toss it to the center in this stack in the center here. This is the pool, and hence this is pool brainwriting. Classical brainwriting is just simply there's a stack by each person. But pool brainwriting is great if you can get everybody around a table, and you just give them maybe 4 or 5 minutes to write as many stakeholders, one per index card, as possible. And the only thing you ask them to do is write legibly. You also tell them that as soon as you've written that stakeholder and you throw it to the center, you don't own that card anymore. We collectively own it because we're going to analyze it and take it apart. You give them a few minutes to do this, and what happens is the brain works that the top of mind, the easy to find stakeholder names or groups are going to pop out. They're going to put them on the index cards, and they're going to throw them to the center. Then it's going to get harder. And what I recommend is that you tell them that during this 4 or 5 minutes, if you start running out of ideas, go fishing through the pile that everybody else has been contributing to, because you might see a name or the name of a group that will stimulate another idea. Kind of like what happens in brainstorming, which in brainstorming, we're listening to other people, and sometimes that stimulates idea. So here's the cool thing. If you've got 6 people working together all at the same time, in 5 minutes, you're going to get 30 to 50 different stakeholder names. And there'll be a lot of these that overlap. They'll be the same stakeholder, or you might even end up with a stakeholder group that somebody puts on an index card, and somebody names some of the people that are on there. But we can go through these index cards and sort them into stacks of stakeholders. And you can even put them into affinity types, like these are subject matter experts, these are customers, however it works best for this group to help sort it out, and get rid of the duplicates and the overlaps at that point. And what you'll find is you've got about 5 minutes of real work, and you might let them rest and then give them another couple minutes, depending on whether it feels like they've dumped as many ideas. But you'll have maybe 45 minutes to an hour sorting through all these cards. And while you're doing that, some new names will come up to it. But in an hour and 10, 15 minutes, you'll probably be done with this. Still reserve a couple hours because sometimes it takes longer than that. So any questions about brain writing before I go on? I actually can't see the chat, I see.
Yeah, Ron, I'm not seeing any come in.
Okay. So the cousin to, and feel free to dump these when you have an idea. The cousin to brain writing is called pin card technique. And in this case, what you do is again, if we're physically together, is take easel chart paper and put it up on the wall, several sheets. And at the top of each sheet, put what the affinity is that you want people to give you names or groups of stakeholders in. So we've got users, we've got subject matter experts, whatever you decide you want to collect it on, and then give sticky notes. And in this case, usually I have a bunch, just give them sticky notes, not really big ones, sticky notes, and ask them to do the same thing that you did in brain writing, one stakeholder or stakeholder group per index card, put it on the appropriate easel chart paper. And what'll happen, it's self-sort, but then you'll still take the group and go back and get rid of the duplicates and overlaps. So just another way to go about doing it. It depends on how much wall space you've got, whether people are willing to get up and walk around and move. So pick your pleasure on that. They both get to the same thing. What I would recommend that you do not do is try to brainstorm your way through this, because that's serial, one idea at a time. What takes, a few minutes to collect in brain writing or pin card technique will take many, many times longer in brainstorming, and then you'll still have to sort things out. Now, in the virtual world, this gets harder because we don't have index cards or sticky notes with people all together. So there's a couple tools that I'd recommend that you consider. Many of you probably are aware of Trello. Trello is a free service that's out there. It's owned by Atlassian. Actually, Atlassian, which is Jura and Confluence, they bought Trello as kind of the gateway drug to their product, because there's a huge population that use Trello, and it's very similar to now the Kanban or Scrum approach that's in their products. So they bought this in order to try to get people to move up, but they've continued to make it available. So it's a free tool. It's at Trello.com. You can make as many boards as you want. And just like in pin card technique, you can make each one of these boards a particular affinity that you're looking for. And then people working simultaneously online, they do have to log in and get an account. But once you give them the access to this particular account, they can simultaneously add to your boards. So it's just a nice, easy, fun way, and Trello has been around long enough that most people appreciate and find it pretty easy. Another tool is Jamboard, which is owned by Google. So it's also free, and you can make as many boards as you want, that you invite people into one site that has unlimited number of boards. Again, each one could be an affinity, and they can add as many cards as they want and write on these cards. And you can see in this particular case, it was for a whole nother purpose, but we had this was about a 10-minute exercise where, with a group of people, I asked them, what are your accomplishments? And they started dumping it in there. And this particular board was accomplishments for this particular group. But you could work this any way you want. And then people can pick these cards up and move them, just drag and drop, just as if we were doing it with index cards or sticky notes. So Trello, great tool, and Jamboard. Problem with Trello is that they have to log in and get an account. The problem with Jamboard is that they have to have a Google account in order to be able to use it. The advantage of both of these is they're free. If you are on Microsoft Teams, which many of the agencies in the state are going to Teams as part of the Microsoft 365. There's a shared whiteboard that you could do. It's not as elegant as this, but you could use that, work on it. So any questions before I go on to stakeholder analysis? Hearing none so far, I'll move forward.
See one real quick, Ron. Just
Sure.
slipped in at the last second there. Are these sites approved for state business?
Man, I don't know. I'm about to find out because I'm working with an agency on strategic planning and I've recommended Jamboard and they said they'd look into it. So I don't know. Great question to ask. And if somebody else happens to know, if you could post it, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, somebody replied Trello definitely is.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
And then cybersecurity services approves agency use on case-by-case basis.
Okay.
And then we got a couple other questions. One simply says cloud workbooks.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm writing that down because I haven't heard of that. Cloud workbooks. Okay.
And then another question, and then I think we'll move on. It says, do you consider these results to be part of the formal project file? If so,
Yes.
how do you include them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So you would boil these down. So first off, open meeting records, right? So anytime you create a record like this and you're part of the state, this becomes an official document. So you don't want to get rid of it, you want to document it. But if you're in the project world, in your project management plan, you want to boil these down, and that's where you will list your stakeholders and put them in there. I'll talk a little bit more about that in stakeholder analysis, but the project management plan is where you would put that. You initially put it in the charter, and that's just to document whatever you know right up front. But once you move further into the planning process group, number 2 of those process groups, you'd put it in the project management plan. And if you are not going so formal as a project management plan, you want to put it in a shared file someplace. Again, if you're working in teams, create a little site for your project and stick this information in there, and it's perfect. Once you archive your project, though, you don't want to lose that. So you need to have a way to make sure that it lives on, because this information can be very helpful for a later project. If you're a business analyst and you're doing this, you may not be quite as formal because you may be part of a project and feeding this up to the project. But if it's a really small effort and it's not part of a larger project, you still want to keep this as a file for everybody that is working on your project. And again, I go back to a shared resource like team. So hopefully that answered that question. So I'll go on, but feel free to ask questions, additional ones. I'll stop, but also just interrupt me. So stakeholder analysis. Stakeholder analysis, I'm going to ask, there's 2 basic questions here. Who are these stakeholders? And, not by name now, but what do they represent? And what's our strategy of working with them? And in order to answer that, I'm first going to address the who are they, and I'll give you 2 activities that you could use and 3 tools. And I'll dive into this and then I'll get into the second part. So the 2 activities, the first one, and anybody that's a business analyst, you know about elicitation. Elicitation comes in many different forms, 3 primarily: the interview, the survey, and the focus group. Same thing goes here. To get to know your stakeholder, the number 1 approach is an interview. Now, if you have hundreds of stakeholders, that may not be practical. But if you can sit down with your stakeholders and build a relationship, your project, your effort is probably going to be significantly better. So there's a couple of things in terms of an approach. First is, if you're going to invite somebody to any kind of a meeting, online, virtual, physical, whatever it is, your invitation's got to be pretty clear, because they may not know who you are and they're pretty busy and they get lots of email and they're not looking for another meeting. So you need to make it enticing. You need to let them know why this is important, that they're a potential stakeholder or they already know they're a stakeholder. Here's the effort, and you just want to get to know them, and it's going to be a pretty short meeting. And if you can keep this to a half hour, even better. And then open the meeting with introductions and context building so that they know what you're about and what you're trying to do. And remember all the way along is you're trying to build relationship. You're trying to get information from them, but you're really trying to build a relationship. And that will pay off well later in whatever engagement that you've got. Then ask them the important questions, which I'm going to go through. And there's 2 sets of those questions, and I'll do that on the next slide. But you want to confirm what you've heard from them once you get the answers to those questions, and then invite a dialogue. Invite them to ask you questions or to clarify whatever it is. And then finally, leave them with your contact. And if it's not you, then somebody else. Okay, project managers, if you've got a team that you've put together, I highly recommend you are not the one that goes out and talks to all of the stakeholders. Some of your team members might be better at it or know some of those stakeholders. And just by sheer numbers, it may not be practical for you to be the one to go out. So work with your team to talk about this approach and the questions that I'll go over in just a second, and collect that information in some kind of a repository. And again, back in Teams or in notes or whatever it is. That's OneNote that I'm talking about in notes. Okay, so the kind of questions that you might ask is to explore their needs. And I would start with exploring their needs, because otherwise you feel kind of selfish from their perspective. It's what's their background? How are they connected to this project, and who are they connected to that you might want to know about? That's going to show up later, kind of important. You want to know if their uncle is the sponsor for this project, for instance. I mean, you would hope that that would come up in the project conversation. And it doesn't always, and I've been there when that was the case, and it's awkward later. In fact, I was in a situation where I said, hey, let me go introduce you to the sponsor, and took this guy over, and he said, hi, Dad. And, it's just kind of one of those moments. So what matters to them is the next thing that you want to ask them about, their values and their priorities with respect to this project. So you're keeping it in with respect to this engagement. And they may say, I just don't know much about this project, in which case you try to educate them as much as possible. And if you can't get more information that way, then you open it up about what's their job, what's their priorities, what are they working on, so that later you may be able to get that information connected to the project. And then really important, how do they want us to communicate with them? Email, face-to-face, virtual, do they want a newsletter? Do they want a status update? Do they want to call us only? And some of them fit that category. And then you can get to your needs. How can they help us? Ask them, how do you want to help us? How can you participate in this project? And how can we help them? That's actually part of their needs, but it's coming from your perspective of what do they want from us, because you need to know that. And then finally, what resources do they demand, or rather command? And what you're searching for there is there anything that they have access to that could be helpful on the project? That could be people, equipment, knowledge, whatever it is. Just explore that. You want to be careful about how you're doing all this. It's a conversation, and it's not trying to put them on the spot. You are not doing an elicitation. You're not doing an interrogation. You're having a conversation and building a relationship, but these are the kinds of things that you want to come up with. Another approach to do for the analysis, to gather the information, if it's too large of an audience, is a survey. And I'm not going to talk about focus groups. You could throw that in there, just small group meetings where you're asking some of the same kind of questions. But surveys are actually pretty common when we're doing stakeholder analysis. Again, because it could be a whole department, or it could be a whole agency, or it could be a larger group that you want to get some information about. And the kinds of questions that you would ask are probably the similar questions that you would ask during the interviews. But now you're going to need to minimize, because this is a large audience, you want to minimize the number of these questions. Still leave as many as open-ended as possible, but you're going to have to analyze all of those. So be careful how many questions you ask. So keep the survey short, and then provide context and in the invitation again, and at the top of the survey, so that when they read the invitation, it's like, oh, this sounds interesting. I see it's going to be short, and that does matter to me. Then they open it up and they don't forget what it is. So at the top of the survey, there's kind of a reminder, this is about such and such a project, and we want this information from you. So now you're going to ask the same questions. Which of these are approved through the state? And I don't know. But I do know that at least one state agency uses SurveyMonkey a lot. So at least one state agency is there. But here are a few tools. Typeform is, it's been around forever, you guys. It was one of the earliest ones. It's cheap, it's easy. Google Forms is free. And then Survey Pro is not free, but it can do everything. It is SurveyMonkey taken to the next level. Most likely, you're not going to need that. But there is a free version of Survey Pro as well, so you could do that. Okay, I'll stop here again for questions.
So Ron, I'll back us up a little bit. Looks like we got an answer to what cloud workbooks are.
Okay.
They're a requirement for any cloud-based service agency that agencies are looking to use that aren't part of the current Microsoft 365 suite that we all have access to.
Okay, now I'm disappointed because I thought it was a new tool, but okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. And then someone else said that they also use the Planner app within Teams, although that requires all the participants to have access to the channel that that's sitting in.
And I've never done that, so I can't address it. But man, there's new tools coming out all the time, and I do know that Microsoft is working hard on this, because if you look at Teams 6 months ago, it wasn't nearly as robust as it is today, as an example. Any other questions or comments?
Someone added another, looks like a surveying tool, surveygizmo.com.
Cool. Okay. Another one that I'm not aware of. And there are lots of them out there, so that's good. The good news is you don't need something sophisticated for this, because you're not going to do a lot of statistical analysis, and you're basically going to be spinning on open-ended comments. Same kinds of questions as what the interview is. Anything else?
That's all that's there for now.
Okay, so I'll talk about the who are they. 2A is stakeholder register. Anybody that's been trained in project management, this is going to be a familiar tool, because it's a stakeholder register is a list of who all the stakeholders are. And this is what we typically see placed in the project management plan. This becomes the official record, if you would. However, if there's any political nature, you might be a little careful about what you put in the stakeholder register. You might not put all these columns, and nobody says you have to. In fact, you can add other columns if you want, but the kinds of things that you may be collecting are the name, the title. I usually add contact information, what's their role, and then you can talk about what's their power over the project. Now, I'm going to get into this more in a couple minutes when I get into the power interest grid, which many of you have already heard of as well. But what's their power over the project, and what's their interest in the project? And then any requirements that they have, that they've expressed about success for the project, or concerns that they have for it. These two columns turn out to be incredibly helpful as you're navigating through the latter part of projects. When you start realizing that there's people you haven't heard from for a while, what requirements did they tell us about that we didn't necessarily remember to put in there? Now we can go back and look at it, and what concerns do they have? Unfortunately, there's a thing called submarining. And if this is the visual line, everything above this line, we can see the stakeholder, and some of them are really loud and some are really quiet. Below this line, we can't see the stakeholder. And what we see sometimes is stakeholder will get loud, and then as the project goes on, they go to invisible, they go submarine. And oftentimes that's not because they're satisfied and happy campers, it's that they're going to emerge later like a Polaris missile coming out of the water. They're going to probably show up at the most awkward of time and attack you. But if you attack the project, hopefully, if you've gathered early on requirements, concerns, and you start realizing that some people have disappeared, but they had a lot of these, that'll help you go find these folks that are submarine. And that's actually really important. Okay, so we've got the stakeholder name, title, role, power, interest. We've got the requirements and the concerns. Those are the typical things that we see on the stakeholder register. Now, another tool to look at that probably most of you haven't seen is called the proximity chart. And this comes from a book called The Influence Agenda by Dr. Mike Clayton. And I highly recommend that if you're interested in project management in general, this guy is brilliant. He's written a lot and has some really unique ideas. This comes from him. So this is concentric circles where we're looking at stakeholders. And here's a way to think of it. If we drop a pebble in a pond, it's going to make ripples. Well, the first ripples are those represent the stakeholders that are closest to the project. Those are the ones that are on the project team, that's project sponsor, and those are the key stakeholders that care, the people that are really hyper aware of and involved in the project. But then the further out ripples, you find there are some that are directly involved, there's some that are frequently involved, and then there's some that are infrequently involved. And there's no magic to how many rings you make in this concentric circle chart. You can make 4, you can make more if that makes sense, but it allows you to be able to inventory where your stakeholders are. And you can actually take the names of stakeholders and put them on these concentric circles. Dr. Clayton goes further. What he says is not only can you put them on those places in the concentric circles, you can identify who you perceive to be opposers and who you perceive to be supporters, opposite ends there, and the undecideds on the right-hand side and the bystanders on the left-hand side. Now, bystanders and undecideds, there's a strategy around working with them. Bystanders, you just don't want to tick them off, right? Undecideds, you want to convince them to be positive if that matters. Opposers, you want to neutralize if they're influencing on the project, especially these opposers that are in these inner rings. You probably need to spend some time really figuring out what's going on and what you're going to do to either change the project and the effort to meet their needs, or be aware that there's an agreement to disagree and there's probably going to be some friction as you go down. And one way is to make use of those supporters, help them as much as possible. Another tool that you may not have seen before is called the sociogram. And this is when you start looking at all the stakeholders, now they interact with the project, is start looking at how they interact with each other as well. And this is kind of important, especially from a political and from a rumor mill and from an information sharing standpoint. So we've got the project manager here that's relationship is with the project sponsor. You got the project sponsor that's got a relationship with the managing director. And in this case, the project manager has no relationship with anybody in this internal circle, but there's quite a web of interconnection. So working with the project sponsor to influence and work effectively with the managing director would be a good strategy in this case. And knowing how this web works is kind of important. I wouldn't spend a ton of time on the finance department down here because they're not connected to the rest of them. Finance director, however, is a lot more so, but the sales director connected to everybody. So maybe that's your first most influencing individual that you want to make sure is in the loop and positive as much as possible, and then radiate out from there. So these are called stakeholder alignments, sociograms. I'll stop again. Any questions?
I don't see any, Ron.
Okay. So hopefully the fact that these are new is not kind of like, oh, wow. But hopefully, I mean, it's interesting to me how often I end up using one of these two tools. But the go-to tool, the one that we've all been taught, both in project management and business analysis, called the Power Interest Grid. And I'm going to go through that next. But I'm also going to go through a cousin to it called the Attitude Impact Grid. So the Power Interest Grid is another way to be able to look at all of your stakeholders and put them in boxes. And that sounds terrible, but what we're trying to do is figure out strategically how are we going to work with them. And strategy means clarity, and we really do need to get clear about how we're going to work with stakeholders. And so in this particular grid, we're looking at the power that the individual stakeholder or stakeholder group has over the project and the interest they have on the project. So if you go to the lower left-hand corner here, is they have low power, not a lot of influence on the project, and they've got low interest. Frankly, they are a stakeholder, but they don't care very much, and you don't want to spend a ton of time working with them. So what you want to do is monitor. You want to keep them aware of what's going on, but you want to monitor to make sure that they're not moving in interest or moving in power. But you also want to spend as few cycles as you can. So maybe they're getting a status report, they're getting a periodic update. You might invite them to an infrequent big session where you're just updating on the project, but they don't want to spend a lot of their time on it. Move up from there, still low interest, but now a lot of high power. This is a typical CFO. CFO funds the project and they just want to make sure you don't screw it up. But they don't want to spend a lot of time on that project unless it happens to be something that moves them into the high interest category, which most of the things they fund are not in that sense. So in that case, because they've got money on the line, they care about making sure that that was well invested. They want to be kept satisfied. So good news, bad news, you make sure that you give it to them. They call, you make sure you answer. They have a lot of impact on your project, so you don't want to tick them off, but you're not going to invite them to a lot of meetings because that's something they really don't want. You're not going to flood their inbox with a lot of emails or newsletters or status reports. Again, because that's not something they want. But if you go over here to the lower right-hand corner, low power, but high interest, now we get somebody that does want you to flood their inbox. This is somebody that may call you up and say, hey, Ron, look, you got the coolest project on the planet going on. Can I meet with you maybe just every other day, a couple hours? That's all I need of your time. Just, I want to be aware of what's going on. You know, and I'm exaggerating, but a lot of times people that are in this box, they mean well, but they take an enormous amount of energy in order to give attention to the level that they would like to give. So these people you want to keep informed. You want to do it in a low impact way as possible. And very often, if you've got the opportunity on a project, if you can get them onto a task force or get them involved somehow, it will satisfy that high energy, high interest need that they show. And then the final box is up here in the right-hand corner, which is the high power and high interest. And this is your project sponsor by definition. This is the executive sponsor if there is one. This is the steering committee. These are those key stakeholders. You want to manage them closely. And when I say manage, I do not mean manipulate. I don't mean a negative way whatsoever. I mean, you want to make sure that they get high communications, that you're paying attention to their needs, that if there's good news or bad news, they're getting it right away before the rumor mill. It's that kind of, this is where you focus most of your time and attention. So let me show you the cousin to this, and then I'll open it up for questions. The cousin is that we have how much impact, which is similar to power, on the project. So how much impact do they have on the project? And what's their attitude toward the project? Is it negative or is it positive? So again, I'll start in the lower left-hand corner. They have negative impact. No, they have negative attitude. They don't like your project, but they've got low impact. They just don't have a lot of say for the project or the effort that you're doing. And this might sound bad to some ears, but the strategy is you want to monitor them, and where necessary, you want to outvote them, because the key stakeholders are in a much better place to be able to move the project in the right direction than what these folks are. And so you're doing a little bit of strong arming. Obviously, if you can get them to come to your end of it, you can get to a win-win, great. But unfortunately, a lot of times it takes just plain outvoting, just moving forward, because otherwise it's a drain on your time. Understand, however, that could make them mad. If that makes them mad, they may get a whole lot more negative about your project, and then they may seek power. And all of a sudden they may move from this box to this next box, where now they've gained a great deal more power. They're still negative. And in this group, now you want to woo and win. You want to bring them over. Now you're going to spend a lot of cycles to politically and sensitivity, whatever that word is I'm looking for, appropriately work with them to make sure that you're modifying the project as necessary to bring them over, and you're helping their expectations so that they definitely are coming into it. That takes a lot of work, but as they are gaining more power, more important to do that. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, where they're positive but low impact, what you want to do is inform and coach them. Again, you're not going to spend a lot of cycles on them, but they're positive. They can help spread that positivity. And critical mass does matter. So coaching them, helping them know what's going on, inform them, keep them aware, but you don't want to spend a lot of cycles. And then finally, if they're positive and they're high, now you really enroll them and make use of that positively, again, trying to get critical mass, because whatever effort it is you're doing, critical mass matters when we get to the point of implementation. Okay, any questions at this point?
Again, a nice quiet chat, Ron.
Okay. I'll keep going forward here then. And I got to say, by the way, this monitor and outvote is controversial. However, it is pretty accepted. Again, Dr. Clayton wrote it, and you'll find it in a lot of literature that's out there. So whether you like it or whether I like it, just understand that it is a valid strategy, but make sure in your environment, any strategy you take is acceptable and appropriate. So if this is not appropriate, then take a different strategy. So now we move on to stakeholder engagement management, actually managing the engagement. And we've got the strategy. We know who the stakeholders are. We've got a strategy figured out for the stakeholders. What do we do about that is the next question. And where we go usually with that is to start focusing in on a communications plan. You really have to look at what's the capacity and capability of your team. And if you're a one-person team, you don't have a whole lot of bandwidth. So you can't get too robust in what you're going to be doing. But if you are on a really large project and you've got a dedicated communications officer for your project, you have some really robust capability and you've got some bandwidth. And so you have to tune this up and tune this down appropriate to that. Also understand that if you don't have the bandwidth, the capability, and the capacity appropriate for the project, the risk of failure on your project goes up. And it's a direct correlation. And it may be wise for you to be asking for support around implementation of engagement management, because we've got too many stakeholders. We can't even do the elicitation properly with the number of staff that we've got to be able to do this, no less try to actually manage all the expectations, which is an important part of any engagement. And whether it's a stakeholder, business analyst engagement or a full project management. So risk will go up if you don't have that proper work. But you want to tune your communications plan appropriate to the capability and the capacity. And this communications plan is another document that would show up in your project management plan if you're going to the official formal one. And by the way, business analysts, you could put together a business analyst engagement plan and put all this information in there, especially if it's a large project. And that could become part of the whole documentation that goes along with the project documentation, if not actually included as part of the project management plan. Just again, you want to scale that appropriately. So in the communications plan, I couldn't remember whether I zeroed in on this or not. I didn't. So several columns. Again, you get to decide what columns. I like to keep it really simple. So one column for the audience, another column for the frequency of the communications. The method of the communications comes next. Who's going to do the communications? Who's responsible for it? And then the desired outcome. What I've seen a lot of people add is another column between audience and frequency, and that is what is being communicated. I kind of jump to the desired outcome, and when I'm filling this out, by the way, I start with who's the audience, then I go to the desired outcome, and then I go back to the other columns as appropriate. But adding that other column about what's the communications about may be really helpful. Is this project status? Is this elicitation? Is this confirmation? What is this? Is this a prototype review? Is this a testing plan? Could be in that other column that's in there. One thing I'd recommend too, and I said this before, but you, the project manager, or you, the primary business analyst, if you've got other resources available to you, don't take it all on yourself. even if you're really good at this and you really love it, you'll become the bottleneck and you'll be a risk factor for your project. So you don't want to really look at it. Each audience, and each audience, by the way, is a stakeholder, right? So each stakeholder may have multiple ways to be communicated with and multiple frequencies. Now, this is interesting because every project and every engagement runs in thirds. There's the first third, second third, last third. And it's a little bit like if you're or even reading a book, but this is the standard formula for a novel, is the first third of the book, you get to know the characters. The second third of the book, it gets more complicated, so that 2/3 of the way through the book, the primary characters are in a really tough situation, which gets resolved in the last third of the book. Every project, stereotypically, goes through the same kind of life cycle where, the first third of and by the way, not just project, but every task or activity, every engagement does the same thing, because those are just fractals of the whole, right? So the first third of the project or task or engagement, you're getting to know what's going on, and it doesn't seem that hard. In fact, this is when we estimate way too low in terms of the amount of effort that it's going to take. The second third, it gets more and more and more complex, so that 2/3 of the way through the effort is when you're totally aware of how complicated this is, and bad things are starting to happen that have to be resolved in a known time frame that is now visible. It's not some time frame that looks a long way out. And so 2/3 of the way through, things get kind of complicated. When you're looking at the communications plan, I highly recommend you think in terms of a communications plan in the first third, and then another communications plan that's halfway through the project, and another communications plan towards the end. Stakeholders come and go, stakeholder interest changes, and the complexity of your effort now evolves and changes through it. Any questions about the communications plan?
There was a comment, Ron, that one agency incorporates the matrix that you've got on the screen right now as part of their stakeholder registry, so it's all in one document.
Perfect. Oh, that's cool. Hey, that's really good. That keeps you from flipping back and forth and makes really good sense. One thing I would recommend, I'm going to go back just for a second. If you use any of these tools and you put people's names on the tools, it's really a great practice to go out and talk to those people and let them know what you're thinking about. You may not tell them about the strategy, but you may say, look, I know that your interest is really high or really low on the project, but your influence or power on the project's not all that high. And test that with them. For one thing, if they see that chart and they know you've been talking about them, that could be an ugly moment later on. If you've talked about them, then it's not. And second, you might be just wrong. I did a project with the city of Hillsborough, and we identified the city manager as somebody that had high interest in this project. It was an implementation of an update to a real controversial software system. And we knew that his power was high because he had ultimate authority over the funding plus the project. And so I drew the short straw to go talk to him. I went out and talked to him and said, look, I know that you have a lot of power and interest in this project. He said, wait a minute. First off, I got power only because that's my position. I really don't care about your project. Just don't screw it up. And what he basically said was the classic, I'm over in this box. I'm up here. I do have power, but I just don't have a lot of interest. And so instead of inviting him to a whole lot of meetings, we just made sure when we were at key points along the project to go there. And same thing goes if you do the stakeholder registry that I'm trying to get back to. If you put the power and interest or any other information on here, just be aware you're building a document that they may see. So write it in such a way that it's okay for them to see it. If not, actually spend time with them ahead of time, making sure that they've got it. Transparency matters, and here it matters a lot. Any other questions that came up before I move on to monitor and update?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay, thank you. So last section, monitor and update. The world is dynamic. And as I mentioned, projects come in thirds, and they may come in a whole lot more complicated than that. But I mean, just kind of generically, there's that honeymoon, get to know each other period at the beginning, and then it gets increasingly more complex, and then you got to resolve it toward the end. Things change, and you really want to periodically pull out your stakeholder registry and ask the question, are these still the valid and correct stakeholders? And if you're using any of these tools, update the tool appropriately so that it's reflective of where you're at in the life cycle of this engagement, this project. I can tell you that the longer the project is, the more likely it is the names will change. And when names change, so do attitudes, interests, and backgrounds, maybe even power. And consequently, things could change a lot. To the point where the most dramatic is when a new sponsor comes to town and the whole project gets stopped, right? That kind of changes everything. But short of that, you could have somebody on a steering committee that changes, that starts influencing what the sponsor thinks, that changes what the project scope even needs to be, which then changes what expectations stakeholders have. So you have to keep this pretty dynamic. Two ways to do that. One way is you could start over, do the entire workshop from scratch and say, hey, who are our stakeholders? And try to ignore everything that came before. Or if you want to go faster, is pull out the latest and greatest of your register or any of those tools and then just update it. The first, while a lot harder, is more accurate because it's fresh ideas. Whereas when you look at something that already is, sometimes you're persuaded that that's the way it still is, and you don't go through the critical thinking. I almost always go the second route, but wish I'd gone the first. So just as you see. And then you rinse and repeat. You do this over and over and over again through the project. And again, 3 distinct parts of the project, but the whole project might go through phases. If you're a business analyst and you're in the elicitation portion, that's very different than when you're in the confirmation portion. Very different than when you're coming up with solution sets. Very different than when you're coming up with a prototype. Very different than when you're actually now selecting a prototype. And that's different than when you're testing and implementing. Each one of those probably has a slightly, if not radically different stakeholder group. So you want to go back and really think about, are we connecting to the right people? And the unfortunate thing is really hard projects, the ones that you really ought to be connecting the best with people, and doing stakeholder engagement at top form, unfortunately are also so consuming a lot of times that the last thing you think about is, oh, another letter that I got to send out or meeting I got to have. It's just, you got to get outside of the project and look around. But I'll tell you, if you don't, there are prices that you pay. The risk, again, goes up. Okay, so questions, dialogue. We've got 20 minutes or so, and I wanted to leave plenty of time.
Just giving a couple minutes if folks are typing there, Ron.
Okay, that's good. In the little dots, huh?
Unfortunately, Teams doesn't show us the little dots when people are typing.
Don't.
So we just kind of have to give them a few minutes and see if anything magically shows up.
Okay. If you feel inhibited in this forum, or you don't think of the question till later, by all means, please just get hold of me. I'm really happy to try to answer any of those questions. My goal in all of this is to get you to use these tools and make sure that you've got these concepts. So I'll do my best to try to answer them.
Oh, got a question just came in, Ron.
Okay.
Before I read that one, though, I do also want to point out that the Bang planning team is working out a way to get these recordings because we are recording these forums. We're working out on a way to get them posted to the Bang website so that folks can go on there if they had to jump out early or missed a portion. We also try to get the presentation materials, the slide deck, and post those there as well. So those may spawn further questions as people get to it. And they can also email the Bang mailbox if they lose your email address. and can't get in contact with you, and then we can get in touch with you as well for those. So the question that came in, how can you sell management on improving stakeholder engagement?
Wow, that is a great loaded question. How do you sell management on improving stakeholder engagement? So, I mean, you could scare them. You could talk to them about what happens when you don't have good stakeholder engagement. I don't recommend this, but let's just go down that path for a minute. Is that when you don't have good stakeholder engagement, you don't know what you don't know. So you've got some people out there that may just be building, they're those submariners, right? They're down here building force that are going to come at you. And you won't be prepared to be able to respond to it. Whereas if you've been aware that they've submarine, you can actually go out proactively and try and get hold of them. Or even if they're dissatisfied and they're up here, you know what you know now and you can work on it. The thing about management typically knows that already. So instead, I think I would talk to them about anytime we're in an engagement, we want to make sure that we are getting the best support, both for implementation, but also so we're coming up with the right design. And to do that means that we need to be eliciting and gathering the right information from the people that are going to use whatever it is, or are going to be influenced by whatever it is that we do. We also need to make sure that politically we're not missing something as we go along. And I think I would go down that route, so it's not scaring them, but rather the opposite, telling them the value of good stakeholder engagement. And then when they come back and they say, well, how much is that going to take? The right answer, of course, is it depends on the project and where we're at in the project. But the more practical answer, I think, is let's sit down and do an exercise to figure out how many stakeholders there are and get some management members with you. And then you can talk about what it's going to take in order to communicate and engage those. Because if they're a part of, if they've got skin in the game of coming up with who are the stakeholders, their interest and awareness is going to be much higher. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of how to do this.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. And we've got a couple others that came in.
Sure.
In your experience, are there benefits to BAs developing a communications or stakeholder engagement plan separate from the PM on the project?
I got to be careful here. And the reason why I got to be careful is because theoretically there shouldn't be a separate plan, that the project should be integrated as a whole. But the answer that I have to say from my own experience is yes. Sometimes the audience, the stakeholders that the BAs care about and need to work with are such a small but very important subset to the whole project that they just get lost when you put them into a stakeholder register for the whole project. And so if there's a way that you could take the project tools, whatever they are, but the stakeholder register and the communications plan, and have a separate section for the business analysis, that'd be great. The danger of having a separate business analysis plan, communications, engagement, any of these plans, is that you may have other people on the project that are talking to those same stakeholders. And the reason why you want it integrated is because the same messages and the same communication, same frequency should be managed from a project level. But again, the danger is you can lose it at the project level if you can't pull it out and identify it as important for the business analyst.
Thanks, Ron.
Sure.
So the last question we've got currently in the chat is, when you've got a very large pool of customers as stakeholders, what methods do you recommend to select a manageable sample of them from whom to solicit input?
Okay, this is a great question. And this is a typical survey question. So we want to get a representative sample from a large audience. It will depend on the statistics of that audience. If they're homogeneous, they're all the same, then it's pretty easy statistics that what is your confidence level and what's the survey size that you have to go get. Most audiences are not homogeneous. And most of the time, it's almost impossible to apply those wonderful statistics to it. So instead, what I recommend you do is you try to break the customer or stakeholder groups into categories, and then go talk to some of the people in the categories and listen to the stories. If you find that you're getting similar stories from several people in the same category, you probably don't need to talk to a lot of people in there, because within that category, there's a lot of sameness. They're homogenous. If, on the other hand, you're getting different stories coming back, you're going to have to keep increasing your sample size until you have a sense of what those stories are. Well, it's not going to be statistically accurate, but it's going to give you a sense of what their needs are, or what their opinions are, or where they're at. Again, the ideal world is that they're homogeneous and you just apply sample size statistics to it, but it's usually not that easy. Usually you have to break it down into smaller segments, take each one of those segments and then test to see how homogeneous each segment is, and then increase the sample appropriate to be able to get a good picture, even not statistical, but a good picture of what's going on in there. Hopefully that answers that question and all of these questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ron.
Other questions?
Yep, one more.
Okay.
Working multiple projects with a program whose manager has retired and COVID budget constraints negate a replacement at all or for a very long time. How would you change the way you look at the projects if you were me?
So repeat it one more time, because there are 3 different pieces to it, and I want to make sure I get the first one right.
So the prefacing statement, working multiple projects with a program whose manager has retired, COVID budget constraints negate a replacement at all or for a very long time.
Right.
So in that environment, how would you change the way you look at the project if you were me? So
if the project is part of a program, and the program, we just talked about, the manager has gone away, there are still stakeholders. So what you really want to make sure is that you're not getting contrary to any changes that's going on in the program, and you want to know where your project is in the pecking order of that program. Because if you're at the top of the pecking order, you can ask for and expect to get resources. Whereas if you're at the bottom of the pecking order, others are going to ask you to take resources off your project, and it would be appropriate to do that because you're at the bottom of the pecking order if those resources are going off to the other projects. But now we've got a missing manager. That manager was getting guidance from some stakeholders, really critical to go find out who those stakeholders are. And if you can't get the stakeholders for the whole program, at least try to get them for your project so that you're as in touch as you possibly can. But the ideal is you get feedback from stakeholders for the whole program, because it may be moving, and from your stakeholders on your project, which may be moving within that domain of the program itself. That's a tough situation, and especially the comment that the manager is going to be absent for a long period of time. I think step number 1 for me would be go find out who the manager's boss is and make sure that you talk to them about this missing piece. And then second, if your project's got a sponsor, go talk to, that's different than that manager, go talk to the sponsor. Those become 2 real advocates to help you, both from the program side and from your project side. And then I'd probably drink quite a bit. I mean, just me, but no, I'm kidding there. But hopefully that gives you some ideas. And I know all of you are getting huge pressures because of the distance learning, the budget cuts, and the programs and the projects still have to go on. So this is probably a very real scenario. Go talk to the boss that hopefully is still there. Go talk to the sponsor for your project, maybe your own boss if that's different than the sponsor of the project. And if the program has a steering committee to it, boy, go see if you can get an audience there as well. Other questions?
Nope, just a response on your answer for that one. Said refreshing. That's what has and is being done.
Oh, so good.
Good for them to hear they're on the right track.
That's good. And I hope that's not the drinking point.
At least not on the job.
Well, not to abuse anywhere, but right. Any other questions? So I'm going to stop sharing so that you guys can have this back.
Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and say thank you everybody for attending today. Thank you, Ron. That was an awesome presentation. I know I was frantically taking notes when I wasn't monitoring the chat and had quite a few little takeaways for myself that I can implement in the job right away. So thank you very much. And hopefully we'll have you back again soon sometime.
My pleasure. Just make sure I go before Chris. Remember, that was the
Right,
rule.
right. We got to get the order correct next time. We're learning our lesson there. Thank you. And so our next Bang Forum and the final one for 2020, man, don't we all want 2020 to come to an end? Well, let's just get one more Bang Forum in first. And we've got Jennifer Coburn coming from Portland IABA chapter, and she's going to be talking about traceability. So join us again on Teams for that, December 15th. And with that, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.